The golden palace gleamed under the midday sun, its towering spires casting long shadows over the busy courtyard below. The emperor, adorned in robes of crimson and gold, paced nervously in his private chamber. His mind was heavy with doubt and frustration. For months, he had sought answers to his most pressing questions, answers that seemed just beyond his reach. Advisors, sages, and scholars had all failed him, offering answers that felt incomplete, shallow, or untrue. And so, with no other choice, the emperor had turned to the one person he believed might possess the wisdom he so desperately sought, a Zen monk who lived at the edge of the empire, in a simple temple surrounded by silence. The monk had lived in seclusion for many years, untouched by the world's distraction. It was said that he had knowledge that surpassed that of the most learned scholars, a deep understanding that could not be found in books or debates. The emperor had heard rumors of the monk's wisdom, and so, in a final act of desperation, he summoned him to his palace. When the monk arrived, his appearance was as humble as the stories had suggested. His robes were simple and worn, and his face, though aged, held a serenity that seemed to radiate from within. The emperor greeted him with great pomp and ceremony, offering him the finest food, the richest comforts, and the most lavish gold the kingdom possessed. "I have summoned you here because I need answers," the emperor said, his voice full of urgency. "I am a ruler of vast lands, but I am lost. My heart is troubled, and I do not know what to do. I offer you all the gold in my treasury, all the riches of my empire, if you will only share with me your deepest wisdom." The monk did not respond. He merely stood in silence, his eyes calm, his posture still. The emperor, sensing that something more was expected, repeated his offer more insistently. "I will give you anything you desire, all the wealth of my kingdom, all the power I command, name it, and it will be yours." And still, the monk remained silent, smiling gently but saying nothing. His silence was as profound as the deepest teachings of Zen. In that moment, he demonstrated the most powerful secret of Buddhist practice, the art of detachment. The emperor, frustrated and confused, insisted once more, "Why do you not speak? Do you not care for the gold? The treasures I offer you, is this not what you seek?" The monk, with his smile unchanged, finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "What is the purpose of gold, of power, if one's heart is not at peace? You offer me treasures, but I already possess the most valuable thing in the world, inner peace. This peace is not bought, nor is it won through riches. It is a gift that comes from within, and it cannot be given by another." The emperor, taken aback, could only stand in silence. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his power and riches meaningless. He had sought outward solutions, expecting that wealth could buy wisdom. But in that moment, he understood that true wisdom could not be purchased. It could only be cultivated. The monk's answer did not come in words, but in his silence, in his willingness to remain unmoved by the emperor's insistence, in his calm presence that spoke louder than any decree. The emperor had sought answers from the world, But the monk had shown him that the true answer lay not in wealth or titles, but in the quiet mastery of the self. As the emperor reflected on the monk's wisdom, he realized that his most valuable treasure was not to be found in the kingdom's vast wealth or in the approval of others. It was in cultivating the peace that the monk so effortlessly embodied. The peace that comes when one is no longer bound by the distractions of the world. And in that silence, the emperor saw the great truth that the answers he sought could not be found in material things, but in the depths of his own heart. And so, the monk left the palace without taking any gold or riches, leaving the emperor with a deeper understanding than he had ever anticipated. The emperor's journey had just begun, not towards more possessions, but towards the cultivation of an inner peace that could not be bought. Sorti, a peace that transcended all worldly attachments. The emperor sat in the silence of his grand palace, surrounded by treasures, his mind heavy with the truth that had been laid bare before him. The monk's words, simple yet profound, echoed in his heart. He had spent his entire life chasing external power and wealth, only to realize that the greatest treasure was not something to be attained, but something to be cultivated from within. And now, as he sat alone in his vast chambers, the weight of his newfound understanding began to settle upon him. In that quiet, the emperor sought to understand what had eluded him for so long, the nature of true peace. He called for his advisors, but no one could give him the clarity he sought. There were no more riches to offer, no more titles to bestow. The external world could no longer provide the answers. His gaze turned inward as he began to understand the true meaning of inner peace, as revealed by the monk's silence. It was then that the emperor, for the first time, truly understood what the monk had meant by guarding inner peace. Days passed, and the emperor withdrew from the palace's bustling corridors and overwhelming duties, seeking solitude in the gardens surrounding his home. He walked along the path, contemplating the teachings that had been revealed to him. He began to imagine his mind as a still, pristine lake. For years, that lake had been disturbed by ripples, distractions, desires, and demands from the world outside. His inner peace, once clear and unwavering, had been clouded by the noise of his pursuit of wealth, status, and control. But in the silence of his solitude, the emperor began to see how easily his peace could be disturbed. A thought of someone's disapproval, a fleeting criticism from a courtier, or the pressure to fulfill his duties would send ripples through his mind, clouding his inner clarity. He realized that, like the still lake, his mind could reflect the world perfectly if only he could keep it undisturbed. In that moment of insight, he understood the first sacred teaching of Buddhism. True peace is not found outside, but within. The external world, with all its chaos and demands, could not be controlled or manipulated, but within himself, he had the power to create stillness. As he meditated on this, he began to apply the monk's wisdom in small, practical ways. Each time a disturbance arose, whether it was an urgent request from his court or a worry about the future, the emperor paused. He would breathe deeply, returning his focus to the stillness within. He began to guard his peace as one might guard a sacred temple, knowing that peace was fragile and must be protected from the noise of the outside world. But there was something more. The emperor realized that peace wasn't merely a personal matter. It was not something that could exist solely within him and be contained by his own walls. It had to extend outward, touching others in a way that uplifted them, not through force or decree, but through a shared sense of calm. This new understanding was a deeper layer of the teaching the monk had shown him. Peace was a reflection of how he engaged with the world, not simply a private state of mind. One day, while walking through the gardens, the emperor came across a group of his servants arguing over a small disagreement. The emperor could hear the raised voices, the tension in the air. For a moment, he felt his inner calm waver. Old patterns of judgment and frustration began to surface. But then, he remembered the teachings of the monk. Instead of intervening in anger or judgment, the emperor closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and centered himself. He then approached the servants, his voice soft but firm. "The disturbance of your hearts is causing ripples in the calm of our world," he said, quoting a truth that had become clear to him. "If you wish for peace, you must first find it within yourselves." The servants fell silent, taken aback by the emperor's calm demeanor. They had expected rebuke or reprimand, but instead, they felt the presence of something more, a stillness that reached into their own hearts. In that moment, the emperor became a living example of the teaching he had received. He was not merely a ruler in his kingdom, he was a steward of inner peace. After that encounter, the emperor continued his practice. He began each day in solitude, cultivating his inner peace through meditation and mindfulness. He no longer rushed through his duties, nor did he allow the expectations of his court to dictate his mood. Instead, he responded with calm, taking time to reflect before making decisions. His actions were deliberate and measured, not out of fear or obligation, but from a place of deep, unshakable peace. Over time, the emperor noticed a shift in the energy of his kingdom. The people around him, his advisors, his courtiers, even the common folk, began to reflect the stillness he embodied. His actions, no longer driven by the need for validation or approval, were a mirror of the inner peace he had cultivated. His kingdom, though still filled with the usual responsibilities and pressures, felt lighter, more harmonious. The emperor understood now that true leadership was not about imposing will or managing external affairs. True leadership was about embodying peace and allowing that peace to ripple through the lives of others. As he moved through his day, he carried the lessons of the monk with him, knowing that his peace was the foundation upon which everything else would flourish. As the years passed, the emperor's reign became legendary. He was not remembered for his vast wealth or military victories, but for his wisdom, his ability to remain calm in the face of adversity, and his deep compassion. The teachings of Zen, though simple, had transformed him and his kingdom, and it all began with the realization that inner peace was not a luxury or a rare gift, but a practice that anyone, even the emperor, could cultivate. And so, the emperor continued to walk his path, not as a ruler of riches, but as a protector of peace, guarding it within himself and sharing it with the world. As the emperor continued to embrace his practice of inner peace, a subtle transformation began to take place within him. He had come to understand the importance of guarding his mind against the distractions of the world. But now a deeper question arose within him. How could he ensure that his peace remained untouched by the shifting tides of external validation, praise, and criticism? For years, the emperor had been motivated by the approval of others, his advisors, his people, even his enemies. Every decision he made, every action he took, had been influenced by the desire to maintain his power, to receive admiration, to avoid criticism. But now, as he began to cultivate peace within, he realized that seeking external validation was like throwing a stone into his calm lake, disturbing the stillness he had worked so hard to create. One afternoon, as the emperor sat in his private chambers, he began to reflect on his life. His heart felt heavy with the realization that he had spent so much of his time and energy seeking approval. He had surrounded himself with people who flattered him, who praised him for his decisions, and who never questioned his authority. But in doing so, he had also become vulnerable to the opinions of others, allowing his peace to be influenced by their approval or disapproval. The emperor was reminded of a teaching from the monk. True peace is not found in the validation of others. If he allowed his serenity to depend on external praise, he would always be at the mercy of others' opinions. It was time to let go of the need for validation and to embrace a deeper sense of self-worth, one that came from within and not from the world outside. The next day, the emperor decided to test this understanding. He gathered his court, as he did on many occasions, to discuss matters of governance. His advisors were there, eager to offer their opinions, to seek his approval, and to reaffirm their loyalty to him. As they spoke, the emperor listened intently, but something was different. Instead of reacting with enthusiasm or defensiveness based on the words of his courtiers, he remained calm, centered, and detached. He noticed how easily he could be swayed by the approval of others, how their words could shape his decisions, shifting his actions like the wind. But this time, the emperor did not allow himself to be moved by their praise or their criticism. He simply listened. When it came time for him to speak, his words were measured, thoughtful, and not influenced by any need to be liked or admired. He made decisions from a place of clarity and wisdom, not from a desire for validation. After the meeting, one of his closest advisors approached him, a concerned look on his face. "Your Majesty," the advisor began cautiously, "I noticed that today you seemed different. You did not engage as you usually do with our suggestions. We were concerned that you were displeased with our counsel." The emperor smiled softly, feeling the truth of his practice in the stillness of his heart. "I am not displeased with your counsel, nor am I here to seek your approval. I listened today not with a desire to be praised, but with the intention to act from my own clarity. I have come to understand that true peace does not depend on whether I am liked or not. It depends on whether I am true to myself, whether I am acting with wisdom and compassion. The advisor looked at the emperor, a hint of realization dawning in his eyes. You have found something deeper than the need for approval, he said slowly, and it has brought you peace. Yes, the emperor replied. I have learned that seeking validation from others is a trap. It keeps us bound to the opinions of others, and it disturbs our inner calm. By detaching from this need, we free ourselves to act with authenticity and integrity. As the days passed, the emperor continued to practice detachment from external validation. He no longer sought the praise of his court or the admiration of his people. He made decisions based on what was right, not what was popular. He began to see how often he had relied on others' opinions to shape his sense of self-worth, whether it was praise for his leadership or the flattery of his subjects. He had allowed these external forces to dictate his peace. Now, however, he was learning to be free of that. His self-worth was no longer tied to how others saw him. Instead, he found a deep sense of validation from within. This inner strength was not born of arrogance or pride, but of a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was aligned with his deepest values and wisdom. The emperor had learned to trust himself, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the need for constant approval. One evening, as he walked through the palace gardens, the emperor reflected on how his life had shifted. The world had not changed. There were still pressures, expectations, and challenges, but he had changed. His peace was no longer fragile, dependent on the approval or disapproval of others. It was a steady, unwavering peace that came from within, and it had allowed him to lead with greater clarity and compassion. The emperor's practice of detachment from validation began to have a ripple effect throughout his kingdom. His courtiers, too, noticed the change in him. They saw how he no longer reacted impulsively to their praise or criticism, how he made decisions with greater calm and wisdom. They began to follow his example, learning that their own peace did not have to depend on external opinions. The emperor's teachings spread beyond his court. His people, too, began to embrace the idea of inner peace, of detaching from the need for constant validation. They learned that true happiness did not come from others' approval, but from being true to themselves, from acting with integrity and compassion, regardless of how the world around them reacted. And so, the emperor's reign became not just one of power, but one of peace. Peace that came not from the riches of his empire, but from the wisdom of detachment, from the deep understanding that true serenity is cultivated within. The emperor's journey was far from over, but he had taken the first steps toward a life of true freedom, a life where his peace was not dependent on the external world, but on the steady calm he had found within himself. As the emperor continued his practice of detachment, another challenge arose, one that was more subtle but just as potent. The more he cultivated inner peace, the more he became aware of how easily he could be swept away by the pressures of external validation, even in the smallest of ways. This time, It wasn't the approval of his court or the praise of his people that threatened his peace, but the subtle desire to share his thoughts, his feelings, and his experiences with others. The emperor had always been a man of great influence. His words had weight, his actions were observed, and his life was scrutinized by those around him. At first, he had shared freely, believing that his words might inspire others, that sharing his thoughts and feelings would create connection. But as he became more attuned to his inner world, he realized the dangers of overexposure. The more he broadcasted his inner thoughts, the more he handed over control of his peace to others. Every word he shared, every emotion he revealed was met with feedback, some positive, some negative. And as he opened up more, he found that his sense of serenity began to slip away, disrupted by the shifting tides of external reaction. One afternoon, as he sat alone in his chambers, the emperor thought about this. He remembered the monks' teachings, particularly the idea that true peace comes from within, and that guarding it was essential. If he continued to expose his inner thoughts to the world, he would be inviting the unpredictable winds of external opinions to disrupt his calm. The emperor understood that the more he shared with others, the more his peace became vulnerable to their judgments, their expectations, and their moods. He thought back to a time when he had openly shared his hopes, his fears, and his plans with his closest advisors. At first, their words had been comforting, affirming, and reassuring. But as time passed, their feedback became more critical, more doubtful. His confidence wavered as they pointed out flaws, questioned his decisions, and expressed concerns. Each comment, each suggestion had planted a seed of doubt within him, clouding his inner peace. He began to realize that the more he shared, the more he gave up his control over his emotional state. The emperor closed his eyes and meditated on this realization. He understood now that there was a profound wisdom in the monk's silence. The monk had shown him that not all thoughts needed to be shared, not all emotions needed to be exposed. Some things were sacred things that should be guarded, not shared indiscriminately. His peace was one of those things. His inner world, his sense of serenity, was something that needed protection, something to be nurtured in the quiet sanctuary of his own heart. The emperor began to practice this new form of detachment. Instead of speaking freely, he would pause before sharing his thoughts with others. He asked himself, will this bring peace? Will it create more suffering? If the answer was no, if his words were not aligned with his true intentions, he remained silent. He began to notice that many of the things he had once shared had not been essential. They had been driven by a desire for validation or connection, but they had not been necessary for his well-being. One evening, a visiting dignitary arrived at the palace, eager to meet with the emperor. The dignitary, known for his eloquent speeches and grand gestures, had heard of the emperor's newfound wisdom and peace. He was curious to hear the emperor's thoughts on the matters of the day. The emperor, who had once eagerly participated in these discussions, now felt a shift within him. He had grown wary of speaking too much, wary of offering opinions that might only serve to fill the air with noise. The dignitary sat across from him, eagerly waiting for the emperor's words. But instead of offering the usual flurry of thoughts and judgments, the emperor sat in silence. He observed the dignitary, noting the subtle impatience in his eyes, the eagerness for conversation, for affirmation. And yet, the emperor felt no need to fill the silence. He simply breathed, centered in his peace, and waited. Minutes passed. The dignitary shifted in his seat, growing uncomfortable in the stillness. But the emperor remained unmoved, his calm demeanor unchanged. Eventually, the dignitary spoke, his voice laced with uncertainty. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have heard of your wisdom, but it seems that you do not wish to share it today. Why do you remain silent?" The emperor smiled softly, his eyes calm and steady. "I am not silent because I have no wisdom to offer. I am silent because there is power in stillness. Sometimes, the most profound truths are not spoken, but felt. Silence is not empty. It is filled with possibility. It is the space where wisdom can arise, free from the distractions of the world." The dignitary, taken aback, did not know how to respond. He had come expecting words, expecting grand ideas and clever insights, but the emperor had given him something far more valuable: presence. The emperor's silence, his detachment from the need to speak, had communicated more than words ever could. In that moment, the dignitary understood that the emperor's peace was not something that could be captured in conversation. It was something that had to be experienced. The emperor continued, "The world is full of noise, full of distractions, but true wisdom is not found in endless words. It is found in the quiet space within, where we are free from the need to prove ourselves, where we are free to simply be. In silence, we are able to listen to our own hearts, to the hearts of others, to the world around us. And in that listening, wisdom arises." The dignitary nodded, slowly beginning to grasp the depth of the emperor's words. He had come seeking answers, but what he had received was a lesson in how to truly listen. The emperor's peace, his detachment from the need to constantly engage with the world, had shown him that wisdom does not always come from speaking. It often comes from simply being present, from being still. As the dignitary left the palace, the emperor reflected on the experience. He had begun to understand that detachment did not mean withdrawing from the world. It meant engaging with the world in a different way, not through endless words and opinions, but through stillness and presence. The emperor had learned that the true power of silence lay not in avoiding the world, but in engaging with it from a place of deep inner peace. And so, the emperor continued to practice his detachment, not just from the opinions of others, but from the need to share every thought, every emotion, and every idea. His peace was now his own to guard, and he knew that by doing so, he could move through the world with a quiet strength that was unaffected by the noise around him. In the quietude of his chambers, the emperor sat in deep contemplation. The world outside continued with its usual hustle, but inside, he had begun to understand something even deeper than the previous lessons. His peace was no longer just about guarding his external world from criticism or praise, nor was it solely about detaching from external validation. The emperor had come to realize that the most potent force Affecting his inner calm was not the world around him, but his own thoughts. It had been some time since the monk had left the palace, yet his teachings lingered like the faint scent of incense that remains long after the smoke has dissipated. The emperor now realized that even though he had mastered external detachment, his mind was still prone to disturbance. His thoughts, the ones that arose unbidden in response to the world, still held power over his peace. This new realization unsettled him, but it also presented an opportunity. Buddha's teaching on the mind echoed in his memory. Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts. The emperor understood now that the mind, left unchecked, was fertile ground for suffering. Just as a neglected garden could become overrun with weeds, so too could the mind be overtaken by negative thoughts. If allowed to grow unchecked, these negative thoughts could choke the joy and vitality from his life, just as weeds could strangle the plants they grew around. The emperor recalled how easily his mind had once been consumed by worries, criticisms, and self-doubt. He thought about the countless nights spent lying awake, replaying the day's interactions in his head, wondering if he had made the right decision, questioning his actions, his worth, and his leadership. His thoughts had often been like a tempest, wild and unrelenting, and it was no wonder that his inner peace had been so fragile. But now, with a growing sense of awareness, the emperor realized that thoughts, like all things, were impermanent. They arose and they passed. They were not fixed truths. They were simply mental formations, influenced by external conditions and internal dispositions. Buddha had taught that the mind could be tamed, just as a wild horse could be guided with patience and discipline. The emperor understood that his thoughts did not define him, and that he had the power to cultivate them with mindfulness and intention. The question then became, how could he guard his mind from the negative thoughts that so often arose? How could he protect his peace from the storm of his own mind? The emperor began his practice with small steps, recognizing that the work of taming the mind was not something that could be accomplished in a single day. He began with his morning routine. As he woke, he would sit in silence, observing his thoughts without judgment. At first, the thoughts came in a rush. Anxiety about the day ahead, concerns about his responsibilities, doubts about his ability to lead. But instead of becoming entangled in them, the emperor simply observed them, like watching clouds pass across the sky. He did not cling to them, nor did he try to push them away. He simply let them come and go. He reminded himself that thoughts, no matter how persistent or strong, were not the truth. They were merely temporary visitors in his mind, here for a moment before moving on. By acknowledging them without attachment, he was able to create a space between himself and his thoughts. In that space, he found peace. The emperor then turned his attention to the more habitual patterns of negative thinking, his tendency to criticize himself and others, his tendency to dwell on past mistakes or future anxieties. He realized that these negative thoughts were like a slow poison, draining him of energy and clouding his clarity. He had been so accustomed to them so identified with them that he had not even noticed how they had taken root in his mind. Each time a negative thought arose, the emperor practiced mindful awareness. He would pause, breathe, and ask himself, is this thought helpful? Is it bringing me closer to peace, or is it pulling me away? If the thought was not serving his peace, he would gently release it, replacing it with a more positive or neutral thought. He reminded himself that he had the power to direct his attention, that he was not at the mercy of every thought that arose. The emperor also began to recognize the power of gratitude in cultivating a positive mindset. Each day, he would take a moment to reflect on the things he was grateful for: his health, his home, his people, the simple pleasures of life. By focusing on the positive, he was able to shift his mind away from the negative thoughts that had once dominated his thinking. This simple practice of gratitude became a powerful tool in his journey to cultivate a peaceful mind. The emperor was surprised at how quickly his mental state began to shift. His thoughts, which had once felt like unruly waves crashing against him, now felt more like gentle ripples. The more he practiced, the more he understood the power of the mind to shape his experience of the world. He saw how much of his suffering had been self-created through his attachment to negative thoughts and his identification with them. And now, by cultivating positive, compassionate thoughts, he was beginning to create an entirely different experience of life. One day, while walking through the palace gardens, the emperor encountered a situation that tested his newfound practice. A visiting dignitary, eager to gain favor with the emperor, made a comment that was both condescending and critical of the emperor's leadership. In the past, the emperor would have reacted immediately, defending himself, becoming irritated, or even feeling slighted. But now, as the dignitary spoke, the emperor felt a wave of thoughts arise, doubts about his leadership, the urge to defend himself, the feeling of anger. But this time, he did not let those thoughts take root. He paused, breathed, and observed the emotions and thoughts that arose within him. Instead of reacting impulsively, the emperor simply smiled and replied, "Thank you for your perspective. I will consider your thoughts carefully, but know that I lead with what I believe is best for my people. Your words do not disturb my peace." The dignitary, taken aback by the emperor's calm response, hesitated before replying. He was used to provoking reactions, but the emperor's peaceful demeanor had disarmed him. The emperor, in that moment, realized that by not reacting to the external criticism, he had protected his peace and upheld his dignity. This practice of mindfulness and detachment from negative thoughts continued to deepen in the emperor's life. He became more aware of the habitual thought patterns that once ruled him and learned to navigate them with calm and wisdom. His inner world, once chaotic and filled with turmoil, began to reflect the stillness he had cultivated through his practice. The emperor realized that his peace was no longer fragile, dependent on external events or the approval of others. It was a steady, unshakable foundation built on mindfulness, awareness, and the power of right thinking. And so, the emperor continued to walk the path of Zen, guarding his thoughts and cultivating his inner peace with the same diligence and care that he would use to protect a treasured jewel. His reign was not just one of power, but one of wisdom and inner strength. And through his example, he showed his kingdom that true peace, the kind that lasts, is not something found in riches or power. It is found within. As the emperor's practice deepened, he began to see the true nature of the mind and its connection to suffering. He was learning that peace was not something to be grasped or controlled. It was something to be observed and understood, a quality that could only arise when one learned to observe the mind without attachment or judgment. One afternoon, as the emperor sat in the palace gardens, contemplating his journey thus far, an old story came to mind, a Zen parable that the monk had shared with him. It was the story of two monks, an elder and a junior, traveling together. The emperor had heard it many times before, but its meaning had only now begun to reveal itself in the context of his own experience. The story went like this. Two monks, one elderly and one younger, were traveling together through a dense forest. They had been walking for hours, the heat of the day pressing down upon them. When they came to a river, the river was wide and the current was strong. At the edge of the river stood a beautiful woman, dressed in fine robes, looking distressed. She was unable to cross, for the water was too strong and there was no bridge. The elder monk, seeing her predicament, walked over to her without a word. Without hesitation, he bent down and gently lifted her, carrying her across the river. The woman, grateful for the help, thanked him as he set her down on the other side. She continued on her way, and the two monks resumed their journey. However, as they walked further, the younger monk grew increasingly agitated. He finally could no longer contain himself and said to the elder monk, "How could you carry that woman? We are monks, and we have taken vows to avoid touching women. How could you violate our vow so easily?" The elder monk looked at the younger monk with a serene smile and replied, "I left her at the river. Why are you still carrying her?" The emperor sat still, contemplating the meaning of the story. He realized that the young monk had clung to the judgment and the rules, unable to release the situation and allow it to pass. The elder monk, on the other hand, had acted with compassion in the moment and then immediately let go of the situation, leaving it behind as he continued on his path. This story, which at once seemed like a simple lesson in humility and letting go, now held a deeper meaning for the emperor. It was not just about releasing attachment to the rules. It was about releasing attachment to thoughts and judgments that clung to the mind. How many times had the emperor, in his own life, held on to judgments, criticisms, and emotions long after the moment had passed? How many times had he allowed his mind to carry the weight of a situation when all that was needed was to let it go and continue on his path? The emperor realized that much of his suffering had been self-imposed through his attachment to negative thoughts. The mind, left unchecked, clung to judgments and grievances, just as the younger monk had clung to the violation of a vow, but true peace, the emperor now understood, came from letting go of these attachments. The elder monk had acted with compassion, then released the situation without carrying it further. This was the practice of Zen, acting in the moment with wisdom and kindness, then letting go, free of attachment. The emperor sat back against a stone bench, letting the story settle into his heart. He knew now that the key to true peace was not just in external detachment or even in guarding one's thoughts from negativity. It was in the ability to let go of the past, the judgments, the criticisms, the grievances, and move forward with a clear mind and an open heart. In that moment, the emperor made a silent vow to himself. He would no longer carry his past with him. He would no longer hold on to the judgments of others or the mistakes of his own past. Instead, he would act with wisdom, compassion, and clarity in the present, and then release the moment when it passed. Like the elder monk, he would carry what was necessary and let go of the rest. The emperor's peace, he realized, was not something to be guarded like a fortress, but something to be nurtured and allowed to flow freely. When he allowed his thoughts and judgments to pass through him like water, instead of clinging to them, he could move through life with greater ease and grace. And in doing so, he would find not only peace, but also wisdom. Wisdom that came from living fully in the present moment, free from the weight of the past. Bangbasu. As the emperor reflected on these lessons, he continued to walk the path of Zen. The lessons of the monk and the teachings of Buddhism had begun to shape him into a new kind of ruler, one whose power was not in his wealth or authority, but in his ability to remain calm and centered, no matter what came his way. He had learned to detach from external validation, to guard his inner peace, and to release the judgments and thoughts that clouded his mind. And now, with the story of the monks and the woman, he had learned the importance of letting go of the past, of not carrying the weight of past actions, judgments, or criticisms. In the coming weeks, the emperor noticed a remarkable change in the way he approached his responsibilities. He no longer reacted to every challenge with the same intensity of fear, frustration, or doubt. He began to trust in his ability to meet each moment with clarity and peace, knowing that his inner calm was not dependent on external circumstances. His court noticed this change in him. His advisors began to approach him with greater respect, not because of his power, but because of his wisdom and the steady peace that radiated from him. The emperor's reign, though still filled with the usual complexities, became marked by a sense of harmony and clarity that he had never experienced before. And so, the emperor continued on his path, now understanding that true leadership was not about controlling others or seeking validation from them. It was about cultivating inner peace, letting go of judgment, and acting with wisdom and compassion in each moment. The emperor was no longer bound by the need for approval, nor by the weight of the past. He was free to lead with clarity and grace, guided by the timeless wisdom of Zen. As the emperor's practice of Zen deepened, he began to notice how much of his inner peace was influenced by the words he spoke and the words spoken to him. He had learned that his thoughts were powerful, shaping his experience of the world, and that detachment from external validation could preserve his serenity. But now, he saw that the way he communicated with others had a profound effect on his emotional state and the environment around him. The Buddha had spoken often about right speech, the practice of speaking only what is true, necessary, and kind. Words, as the emperor now understood, were not just mere sounds. They were potent forces that could heal or harm. The emperor had seen this firsthand in his court, how words could stir the hearts of his people, create conflict, or bring about peace. But most of all, he saw how words could either cultivate wisdom or create suffering. The emperor reflected on his own words, how, in the past, he had often spoken out of anger, impatience, or even the need to assert his authority. He had delivered orders with little thought to their impact, confident that his position would ensure compliance. But now, with a growing awareness of the power of speech, the emperor realized that he had unknowingly caused harm through careless words. There was one instance in particular that stood out in his memory. Years ago, during a moment of frustration, he had harshly criticized one of his most trusted advisors in front of the court. He had been irritated by a failed strategy, and in his anger, he had lashed out. The advisor had bowed his head in silence, accepting the rebuke without protest. But the emperor saw the pain in his eyes. Afterward, the advisor had withdrawn from the emperor's inner circle, and their once close relationship had never fully healed. At the time, the emperor had believed that such harsh words were necessary to maintain control, to make it clear who held authority. But now, with his new understanding of right speech, he saw the damage they had caused. The pain that his words had inflicted was not something he could undo. The trust that had been broken could not be easily repaired. The emperor now understood that words were like seeds. They could either foster growth or destroy it. A single harsh word could tear down years of goodwill, while a kind word could build bridges and heal wounds. He thought of how the monks spoke, how their words were always measured, always chosen with care. The emperor realized that right speech was not about avoiding conflict or silence, but about speaking with intention, speaking in a way that promoted peace, understanding, and compassion. One morning, the emperor decided to put this understanding into practice. He had received word that a group of merchants from a neighboring kingdom had arrived at the palace to present their goods. The merchants, eager to gain favor with the emperor, had brought extravagant gifts, hoping to win his approval. In the past, the emperor might have been tempted to praise them lavishly, or even use their presence to show off his wealth. But now, he paused. Instead of offering praise without thought, he chose to engage with them mindfully. As the merchants presented their goods, the emperor listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the craftsmanship and quality of their items. He acknowledged their hard work and dedication, but he did not offer empty flattery. He spoke with respect, but he spoke truthfully. He spoke from a place of clarity, free from the need to win their favor or assert his power. Later that day, his chief advisor entered the room, surprised by the emperor's change in behavior. "Your Majesty, I noticed that you did not give them the usual accolades they expected," the advisor remarked. "You remained composed, spoke only what was necessary." "Why?" The emperor smiled, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "I have learned that words are not tools to manipulate or to gain favor. They are tools to create connection, to share truth, to foster peace. If I am to speak, it must be with intention, only what is true, necessary, and kind." The advisor looked thoughtfully at the emperor. "You have changed. Your Majesty, you seem different." "I have," the emperor admitted. "I am learning to speak, not to gain approval or control, but to create harmony, to connect with others in a way that is mindful, compassionate, and true. Our words are not just for our benefit, but for the benefit of those who hear them. Right speech is not just about the content of our words, it is about the intention behind them." As the emperor continued to practice right speech, he noticed a subtle shift in his relationships with his advisors, his people, and even with the surrounding world. His words no longer had the power to wound or to divide. Instead, they had become a tool for peace and understanding. In the court, the emperor was no longer viewed as a distant ruler who demanded obedience through fear. His speech, measured and mindful, reflected his growing wisdom and compassion. He communicated not as someone above his people, but as someone deeply engaged with their lives, their struggles, and their joys. His words were no longer commands to be obeyed. They were invitations to dialogue, to cooperation, and to shared understanding. Outside the palace, the emperor's reputation began to spread as a wise and compassionate ruler. He had earned the respect not through force, but through the power of his words, carefully chosen and spoken with integrity. Even his enemies, who once feared his anger and authority, began to see him in a new light. His words, always honest and never clouded by personal ambition, had begun to heal rifts that had seemed irreparable. And yet, the emperor knew that the power of right speech was not just in how he spoke to others, but in how he spoke to himself. The harsh, self-critical thoughts that had once filled his mind, thoughts of doubt, of guilt, of regret, were now recognized for what they were: distractions. By practicing right speech toward himself, the emperor began to soften the harshness of his internal dialogue. He learned to speak to himself with kindness, with understanding, and with patience. In doing so, he discovered a new layer of peace. The emperor's mind, once chaotic and filled with self-criticism, began to reflect the same serenity he had cultivated in his outer world. His thoughts, like his words, became a force for good, not only in the world around him, but also in his own heart. The emperor realized now that right speech, like all the teachings of Zen, was not an abstract concept. It was a practice, a way of life, a tool for creating harmony in both the world and the self. By speaking truthfully, kindly, and with intention, the emperor was not only leading his people but also leading himself toward greater wisdom and peace. the emperor's understanding of right speech and its power began to deepen further, and he realized that there was another aspect of his life that required careful consideration: vulnerability. Throughout his reign, he had been the epitome of strength. His people revered him not only for his leadership, but for his ability to maintain control, his ability to appear unshaken, impervious to the pressures that weighed on him. But beneath the regal exterior, the emperor had known his own struggles, his own fears, and his moments of self-doubt. He had always kept these hidden, locked away, believing that to show vulnerability would be a sign of weakness. But as he practiced mindfulness, silence, and detachment, the emperor began to see that vulnerability was not something to hide. It was an essential part of being human. It was only when he allowed himself to acknowledge his vulnerabilities and choose carefully to whom he entrusted them that he could begin to experience the depth of connection, compassion, and wisdom that was available to him. The emperor had always been cautious about sharing his inner world, but over the years, he had learned that there were times when vulnerability was not only necessary, but also healing. But there was a crucial lesson here. Not everyone who listens truly understands, and not everyone who smiles offers goodwill. The emperor remembered a time in his early reign when he had confided in someone he thought was a trusted friend. He had shared his fears, his doubts, his deepest concerns about his role as a ruler and the challenges he faced. In his mind, it had been an act of trust, a moment of human connection. But instead of offering support, the confidant had used his vulnerabilities against him. Words were twisted, secrets were shared inappropriately, and the emperor found himself exposed, hurt, and vulnerable in a way he had never imagined. That betrayal had left a scar, one that had taken years to heal, but the lesson he had learned from it was invaluable. Vulnerability, while essential for personal growth and connection, had to be shared wisely. There were those who would misuse it, who would exploit it for their own gain, and others who simply could not understand the weight of what you were offering. And so, vulnerability needed to be nurtured, protected, and entrusted only to those who had proven their worth through their compassion and wisdom. The emperor's reflections led him to consider his closest advisors and the relationships he had cultivated over time. He had often felt the urge to share his worries with those around him, to find solace in their words. But now, he saw that he could not share his deepest fears with just anyone. There had to be discernment. Only those who could hold his vulnerabilities with genuine empathy and respect were worthy of hearing them. One day, after a particularly challenging council meeting, the emperor found himself alone in his private garden, feeling the weight of his responsibilities pressing down upon him. He had made a difficult decision, one that had upset some of his advisors. It was a decision that, while necessary, had come with personal sacrifice. As he walked among the flowers, the emperor realized that there was only one person he trusted with his deepest feelings, the monk. He had not seen the monk in many months, but the wisdom the monk had imparted had remained within him. It was the monk's unwavering calm and understanding that the emperor had come to value above all else. It was this presence that had shown him the way to peace, to wisdom, and to vulnerability. And so, the emperor made the decision to invite the monk back to the palace, not as a teacher this time, but as a friend, a confidant who could offer the emperor a space to share his struggles without fear of judgment. When the monk arrived, the emperor led him to a quiet corner of the garden where they could sit together in peace. The emperor had no grand questions, no kingdom to discuss. He simply wanted to share the burden of his thoughts with someone who would listen without judgment. The monk sat silently, allowing the emperor to speak freely. "I have made a difficult decision," the emperor began, his voice quiet, "and though I know it was necessary, it has weighed heavily on my heart. I fear the repercussions, the criticisms, and the consequences that may come from it." The monk listened with patience, his expression serene. When the emperor finished speaking, the monk offered only a gentle smile. "Your heart carries much," he said, "but it is not meant to carry it alone." For a moment, the emperor felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. It wasn't that the monk had offered a solution or even words of comfort. It was that the monk had simply listened, with no expectation, no judgment, just a quiet understanding. The emperor had learned that sharing his vulnerabilities with the right person could be healing. It was not a sign of weakness, but of strength, the strength to acknowledge his humanity, to express his fears, and to trust that those who truly cared would hold those fears with compassion. As the conversation with the monk continued, the emperor felt something shift within him. He no longer saw his vulnerabilities as a threat to his power or dignity. Instead, he saw them as part of his journey toward deeper wisdom and greater compassion. In that quiet space, the emperor realized that his role was not to hide his vulnerabilities, but to recognize them and learn to navigate them with grace. He could not protect himself from all harm, but he could choose whom to trust with his heart. In the weeks that followed, the emperor began to share his vulnerabilities with greater discernment. He sought counsel not from those who sought to manipulate his fears, but from those who could hold them with kindness and understanding. As he did, he found that the weight he had carried for so long lightened. There was no need to hide his struggles or pretend to be invincible. In sharing his humanity, he found connection and support not from his status as emperor, but from his authentic self. The emperor had come to understand that vulnerability, like right speech, was not something to be suppressed, but something to be shared with intention and wisdom. When shared with the right people, it became a source of strength, not weakness. It was a key to building deeper, more authentic relationships and a pathway to greater peace. And so, the emperor continued to walk his path, now understanding that vulnerability was not an obstacle, but a bridge connecting him to others, to his true self, and to the wisdom of the teachings he had embraced. As the emperor's practice of mindfulness and Zen deepened, he found that his inner peace was not solely the result of meditation or detachment. It was also tied to the relationships he nurtured. Over time, he had learned to protect his inner world, but there was something even more delicate than the safeguarding of his peace, his vulnerability. Vulnerability, he realized, was a precious gift, one that could only be entrusted to those who were worthy of it. The emperor had often been surrounded by people who flattered him, praised his decisions, and showered him with the attention that came with his power. But as he had learned over time, not all who smiled at him did so with pure intentions. Some sought his approval for their own gain. Others, driven by envy or ambition, used his vulnerabilities against him. And as the emperor's wisdom grew, so did his discernment about whom he could truly trust with his heart. It was not that he had grown suspicious of everyone. On the contrary, the emperor continued to treat his subjects with kindness and respect. But he had come to understand that trust was a precious commodity, one that had to be earned over time. Vulnerability, he realized, was not something to be freely shared with anyone who asked for it. It was a part of himself that needed to be protected, held sacred, and shared only with those who could hold it with compassion and understanding. One day, a trusted advisor entered the emperor's chambers with troubling news. A plot against the emperor's rule had been uncovered, and several high-ranking officials were implicated. The advisor, a loyal and capable servant of the emperor, had worked diligently to uncover the truth. But the revelation was still painful. The emperor listened in silence, his face betraying little emotion. He had been prepared for this moment, for the betrayal that often accompanies power. But as he heard the details of the plot, a wave of vulnerability washed over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of isolation, the realization that even those closest to him could turn against him. The emperor's heart felt heavy, and his mind swirled with doubts and fears. How could he trust anyone now? But in that moment, he remembered the teachings of Zen, the importance of discernment, the need to carefully choose those with whom he shared his vulnerabilities. The emperor took a deep breath, grounding himself in the practice of mindfulness. He could not afford to make decisions driven by fear or impulsiveness. Instead, he needed to center himself in clarity, not in the turmoil of his emotions. He turned to his advisor, who had been watching him quietly, waiting for a response. "Thank you for bringing this to me," the emperor said, his voice steady. "You have done well in uncovering the truth, but we must not act hastily. We must choose wisely how we respond." The advisor nodded, but there was a question in his eyes. "Your Majesty, do you trust anyone in your court now? This betrayal cuts deep, and many will wonder who can be trusted. Who do we turn to for support?" The emperor took a moment before answering. "Trust is a delicate thing," he said. "It is something that must be earned through time, through consistent actions, and through integrity. The plot against me is a painful reminder that I cannot blindly trust anyone. But there are those who have shown loyalty through their actions, not their words. It is to them that I will turn. But I must also remember to protect my heart. Vulnerability is a gift, not a right, and it must be shared only with those who can hold it with compassion." In the days that followed, the emperor began to reflect on his relationships with the people in his life. He thought about the advisors who had stood by him, the soldiers who had fought for him, the subjects who had trusted him with their well-being. Some had proven their loyalty over time, while others had disappointed him. But as he sifted through his connections, he began to realize that not everyone deserved to know the depths of his struggles, his fears, or his vulnerabilities. He took this lesson to heart. With the help of his most trusted advisors, the emperor carefully crafted a plan to address the betrayal within his court. But even in his decisions, he remained mindful of his inner peace. He did not allow his fear, anger, or hurt to cloud his judgment. Instead, he responded with wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of the impermanence of all things. He knew that even this betrayal, like all things, would pass, and that his peace would remain, unshaken by the external events that sought to disrupt it. One evening, as the emperor sat alone in his chambers, he received an unexpected visitor, an old friend from his youth, a monk who had once guided him in the early days of his reign. The monk had left the palace years ago to live a simple life in a distant mountain temple. His visit was a welcome surprise, and the emperor greeted him warmly, eager to reconnect. As they sat together in the emperor's private garden, the monk asked him, "How have you been, my friend? What weighs on your heart?" The emperor hesitated for a moment, but then he realized that this was one of the few people to whom he could speak freely. The monk had always been a steady presence in his life, and his wisdom was something the emperor had come to deeply respect. The emperor opened his heart, sharing the pain of the recent betrayal, the doubts that had crept into his mind, and the vulnerability he had been grappling with. The monk listened in silence, offering no judgments, no solutions, but simply being present. After a long pause, the monk spoke gently, "My friend, you are not alone in this, but you must be discerning in whom you trust. Vulnerability is a sacred thing, and it must be shared with those who have shown true compassion, true integrity. Not everyone is worthy of that trust." The emperor nodded, his heart feeling lighter. The monk's words resonated deeply within him. He realized that his vulnerability was not something to be hidden, but something to be shared selectively. By choosing wisely those with whom he entrusted his deepest struggles, he could protect his peace and still allow for meaningful connection. In the months that followed, the emperor's approach to vulnerability and trust shifted. He no longer shared his deepest fears and doubts with just anyone. Instead, he chose his confidants carefully, offering his vulnerabilities only to those who had earned his trust through their actions, not their words. And in doing so, he found a deeper sense of connection with those who truly understood him, who could hold his heart with the same compassion that he had learned to cultivate in himself. The emperor's reign continued, not because of his wealth, his armies, or his titles, but because of his wisdom, his understanding of the delicate balance between vulnerability and strength, trust and discernment. And in this understanding, he found peace. As the days turned into weeks, the emperor's practice deepened further, and with it, his understanding of the impermanence of all things. He had already learned the value of guarding his inner peace and vulnerability, of speaking with intention, and of choosing whom to trust with his heart. But now, a new lesson emerged from the stillness of his heart, a lesson that would challenge the very nature of his leadership, his hopes, and his aspirations, the importance of detaching from the outcomes of the future. In the past, the emperor had always been a man driven by goals, by the desire for success, and by the pressure to maintain control. His life had been a constant quest for a future that he could shape with his will, be it the expansion of his empire, the strengthening of his military forces, or the securing of his legacy. He had attached so much of his sense of self-worth to the future outcomes of his decisions. But now, with the teachings of Zen permeating his life, the emperor began to realize how much his attachment to specific outcomes had caused him suffering. He thought about the countless plans he had made over the years, each one carefully crafted to achieve a particular result. When those plans succeeded, there had been satisfaction, but it was fleeting. When those plans failed, as they inevitably did at times, there had been frustration and disappointment. His emotions had been tied to external results, and this constant striving for control had created an undercurrent of stress and anxiety within him. The Buddha's teachings on attachment had always spoken to him, but now they felt especially relevant. Buddha had said that attachment to the future, to specific outcomes, inevitably led to suffering. When we become overly fixated on a particular result, we set ourselves up for disappointment when things don't go as planned. Attachment to the future was like building a house on shifting sand. It could crumble at any moment. The emperor sat in his private chamber, his mind swirling with the complexities of his duties. He had many plans, plans to expand his kingdom's influence, plans to strengthen alliances, plans to secure his place in history. But as he sat there, he felt a deep sense of unease. It was not the weight of his responsibilities that troubled him. It was the growing awareness that his attachment to the future was clouding his peace. He had become so focused on the end goal that he had neglected the present moment. The emperor closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought back to the monk's teachings on impermanence, how everything is in constant flux, how nothing is permanent, and how the future is always uncertain. No matter how carefully one plans, the future will unfold in ways that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. The key, the monk had said, was not in forcing things to go according to our desires, but in embracing the unfolding of life with acceptance and wisdom. The emperor's realization deepened with each passing day. He began to observe how his attachment to outcomes had been a source of stress and dissatisfaction. Whenever he set his sights on a particular goal, he became obsessed with achieving it, and his peace was often disrupted by the fear of failure. But now, he understood that true peace was found in letting go of attachment to results and embracing the journey, no matter where it led. The emperor took a simple example from his own life, a recent diplomatic mission to a neighboring kingdom. He had spent months preparing for it, meticulously planning every detail. He had expected that the mission would secure an alliance that would strengthen his kingdom's position. But when the mission failed to achieve the desired outcome, the emperor was disappointed and frustrated. He had clung to the expectation of success, and when it was not realized, his peace was shaken. But now, with the teachings of Zen in mind, the emperor saw the situation differently. The failure of the mission was not an inherent reflection of his worth or his ability as a leader. It was simply a result of the conditions at the time, conditions that were beyond his control. Rather than dwelling on the failure, the emperor chose to release his attachment to the outcome. He acknowledged the disappointment, but he did not allow it to dominate his thoughts. Instead, he accepted the situation as it was, understanding that it, too, would pass. The emperor began to approach each decision, each plan, each goal with a new perspective. He would still work diligently, as he always had, but he would no longer tie his happiness or peace to the success or failure of the outcomes. He would focus on the present moment, on the steps he could take, and he would trust that the results would unfold as they were meant to. Over time, the emperor found that this shift in perspective had a profound effect on his leadership. His decisions were no longer driven by fear of failure or by the need for validation. He began to lead with greater clarity and calm, no longer rushing to achieve a specific result, but allowing things to unfold naturally. He trusted in the process, knowing that he could only control his actions, not the outcome. This detachment from outcomes also allowed the emperor to lead with greater compassion. When his people came to him with their struggles, he no longer viewed their challenges as obstacles to his success. Instead, he saw them as opportunities to act with wisdom and compassion, regardless of the results. He understood that his role was not to control everything, but to guide with kindness, to support his people through their difficulties, and to be present with them in each moment. The emperor's peace, once fragile and dependent on external circumstances, had become unshakable. It no longer wavered with the rise and fall of his fortunes. He had learned to detach from the future, to release the grip of attachment, and to embrace life as it came. Dalip says, one evening, as the emperor sat in the quiet of his garden, contemplating the changes within himself, he thought about the journey he had undertaken. He had started as a ruler, obsessed with control, consumed by the desire to shape the future. But now, he had learned that true wisdom lay in letting go, in trusting the flow of life and embracing the present moment. The emperor smiled to himself, knowing that his path was not about achieving a specific result, but about living with mindfulness, clarity, and compassion. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of peace, a peace that came not from controlling the future, but from surrendering to the present moment and accepting whatever came. And in that moment, the emperor realized that his journey was not about the end goal. It was about the path itself, the unfolding of life in all its impermanence. The true treasure was not in the destination, but in the journey. The emperor sat silently in his chambers, gazing out across the kingdom. The city beneath him bustled with live people going about their daily routines, vendors calling out their wares, children running through the streets. But inside, the emperor had become increasingly aware of a deeper truth. His actions spoke louder than any decree, any speech, or any promise he made. For so long, he had believed that words were his primary tool for leadership. He had spent years delivering speeches, issuing commands, and declaring his intentions, thinking that his words would shape the course of his kingdom. But now, as his practice of Zen deepened, he saw that words, while important, were often fleeting. They were subject to interpretation, to miscommunication, and to the whims of those who heard them. The emperor began to realize that actions, on the other hand, were far more powerful. Actions, though they could be simple, spoke the truth in ways that words could never fully capture. His decisions, the way he treated his people, and how he lived his life were the truest reflection of his values, his intentions, and his wisdom. It was during a moment of quiet reflection that the emperor recalled a Zen story he had heard from the monk, a story that now seemed particularly relevant. The story was of a gardener who planted a seed. The gardener, full of hope and patience, did not dig up the seed every day to check on its progress. Instead, he trusted the process, knowing that the seed needed time to grow. He watered it, cared for it, and gave it sunlight, but he never rushed the process. The emperor realized that, like the gardener, he had spent much of his life checking and rechecking the progress of his plans, constantly seeking immediate results. He had been obsessed with visible outcomes, with the need to see things come to fruition quickly. But now, he understood that just as a seed needed time and space to grow, so too did his actions need to unfold in their own time, without constant interference or expectation. It was time for the emperor to stop speaking so much about his plans. He realized that by broadcasting his intentions, he had often invited doubt and distraction. His people, too, had become accustomed to hearing grand promises, only to see them fall short. The emperor understood that true leadership was not about announcing goals, but about moving silently, quietly, with steady determination. It was in his actions, what he did each day, how he treated his people, and the decisions he made in the quiet moments that his true leadership will be revealed. One day, an important trade deal was presented to the emperor. The terms were favorable: more wealth for the kingdom, more goods for the people. Yet, as the emperor reviewed the agreement, he saw an opportunity to make a more sustainable, long-term plan for the kingdom, one that would take time and patience to develop, but would bring greater prosperity in the future. His advisors were eager to sign the deal to secure immediate rewards for the kingdom. But the emperor, instead of offering a long-winded speech about his vision for the future, simply nodded and said, "We will wait." In the past, he would have justified his decision with elaborate speeches, laying out his reasons and convincing his court of the wisdom behind his choice. But now, he simply let his actions speak for themselves. He made the decision and allowed time to unfold. There was no need for further words. The emperor had learned that the strength of his leadership was not in convincing others of his rightness, but in making decisions with integrity and allowing the results to speak for themselves. As weeks passed, the decision to wait proved to be the right one. The market shifted, and a more beneficial trade agreement came forward, one that would serve the kingdom for years to come. The emperor's patience had paid off, and his advisors saw the wisdom of his decision. They no longer questioned his choices, for they had witnessed the results firsthand. The emperor had shown them that leadership was not about grand declarations, but about acting in alignment with long-term values, regardless of the immediate rewards. This new approach, allowing his actions to speak louder than words, had a profound effect on the emperor's court. His advisors, once eager to speak and present their ideas at every opportunity, began to listen more carefully. They began to understand the wisdom of silence, the power of quiet action, and the strength that came from leading with integrity. The emperor's actions, though sometimes subtle and silent, were far more impactful than any speech he could have given. One evening, as the emperor walked through the palace gardens, reflecting on the changes in his reign, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned the value of silence in leadership. He had learned that actions, when aligned with wisdom, could lead to true change. The emperor no longer felt the need to announce every move or justify every decision. Instead, he moved with quiet confidence, knowing that his actions would speak for themselves. The emperor thought back to the early days of his reign, when he had been filled with ambition. Driven by the need to prove himself, he had sought external validation, spoken endlessly about his plans, and rushed toward visible success. But now, after years of Zen practice, he had learned that the most powerful achievements were those that unfolded quietly, without fanfare or boastfulness. His leadership, once marked by the need to assert control, was now marked by the quiet strength of patience and integrity. The emperor had become a leader who led by example, whose actions inspired others to follow. He no longer sought to convince others of his wisdom. He simply lived it, and the world around him took notice. As the emperor continued to practice this silent leadership, he found that the true test of his wisdom was not in what he said, but in what he did. His actions simple, steady, and aligned with his values had become the most powerful message he could share with his people. His leadership had shifted from being about control and power to being about presence and example. And so, the emperor's reign continued. But now, he ruled not with words or force, but with the quiet strength of right action. His kingdom flourished, not because of grand speeches, but because of the steady, unwavering path he had chosen to walk. The emperor had learned that actions, when rooted in wisdom, would always speak louder than words. As the seasons passed, the emperor's wisdom deepened. He had learned the art of silence in leadership, the power of right speech, and the necessity of detaching from the outcomes of his actions. Yet, even with all his progress, there remained a final lesson that he had not fully understood, a lesson that the emperor now realized would be the key to true peace in both his personal life and his rule. The practice of patience. The emperor had always been a man of action. His life had been shaped by decisive movements, by the urgency to achieve, to conquer, to secure the future. But now, he began to see how often his impatience had caused him unnecessary stress, how it had clouded his judgment and disrupted the peace he so carefully cultivated. He had learned to act with intention, but there was still the underlying pressure to see results, to see them now. The Buddha's teachings on patience began to resonate within him. Patience was not merely waiting, it was a deep, mindful engagement with the process of life. It was allowing things to unfold at their natural pace, trusting in the timing of the universe, and not forcing outcomes to happen according to his desires. True patience, the emperor realized, was rooted in the understanding that not everything could be controlled and not every result could be achieved on his timetable. The emperor thought about a story the monk had once shared with him, one that had seemed simple at the time, but now held profound meaning. The story was of a gardener, a metaphor the monk had often used to explain the practice of patience. The story went like this. There was once a gardener who planted a seed in the earth. Each day, the gardener tended to the seed, giving it water, ensuring it had enough sunlight, and protecting it from harm. However, after several days, the gardener became impatient. He dug up the seed to see if it was growing, and when he found nothing, he became frustrated. He replanted the seed and repeated the same process, only to find that the seed still did not sprout. Frustrated, the gardener repeated this process many times, digging up the seed to check on it each day. But no matter how much he checked, the seed remained dormant. Finally, the gardener understood that the seed needed time to germinate, to grow in the darkness before it could break through the soil and reach the light. In his impatience, the gardener had been sabotaging the very process he was trying to nurture. The emperor sat silently, reflecting on the gardener's wisdom. How often had he been like the gardener, impatiently checking the progress of his plans, rushing to see the results of his actions? He had been so focused on the outcome that he had not allowed things to unfold in their own time, to grow at their natural pace. The emperor realized that this impatience had caused him stress and dissatisfaction, as he constantly sought immediate results. But the true practice of patience was about trusting the process, about allowing time to work its magic. With this understanding, the emperor began to shift his approach to leadership. He no longer rushed to see the immediate effects of his decisions. He began to trust that his actions, when rooted in wisdom and compassion, would bear fruit in their own time. He no longer felt the need to control every outcome. Instead, he learned to allow things to unfold, knowing that some seeds took time to grow. One day, a neighboring kingdom proposed a treaty that promised to bring great wealth and stability to the empire. The emperor, eager to secure the future of his people, was initially tempted to act quickly, to sign the treaty and secure the benefits. But as he reflected on the teachings of patience, he realized that rushing into an agreement without the careful consideration could lead to unforeseen consequences. The emperor decided to wait. He took the time to fully understand the implications of the treaty, to listen to his advisors, and to carefully assess whether it truly aligned with his long-term vision for the kingdom. The emperor's decision to wait was met with some criticism. His advisors, eager to see the immediate benefits of the treaty, urged him to act quickly, but the emperor remained calm. He understood that patience was not about inaction. It was about allowing the right conditions to come together. He trusted in the process, in the wisdom of the teachings, and in the timing of life. Months passed, and during that time, unforeseen challenges arose in the neighboring kingdom that altered the terms of the treaty. Had the emperor rushed into the agreement, he would have been bound by a contract that would have ultimately led to unfavorable outcomes. But by practicing patience and waiting, the emperor's kingdom avoided the potential pitfalls of the treaty and was able to forge a more beneficial agreement when the time was right. As the emperor continued his reign, patience became a cornerstone of his leadership. He no longer rushed to implement changes or seek immediate results. He learned to trust that things would unfold at their own pace, and he understood that every action, no matter how small, had its own rhythm. Some things require time, space, and careful nurturing, just like a seed that needed time to grow. The emperor's newfound patience was not only reflected in his leadership, but in his personal life as well. He became more patient with himself, recognizing that he, too, was a work in progress. He no longer rushed to fix his perceived flaws or to force personal growth. Instead, he allowed himself the time and space to grow naturally, to learn from his experiences without the pressure of achieving perfection. His life, like his reign, was no longer about seeking constant control or immediate results. It was about walking the path with mindfulness, with trust, and with patience. One evening, as the emperor walked through the palace gardens, reflecting on the lessons he had learned, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to understand that true leadership was not about rushing to meet external goals, but about cultivating patience and trust in the natural unfolding of life. He had learned to guard his peace, to practice right speech, and to release his attachment to future outcomes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the emperor felt a deep sense of contentment. His reign was no longer about the conquest of territories or the accumulation of riches. It was about the quiet wisdom he had gained through patience, mindfulness, and the steady cultivation of his inner world. The emperor had learned that true power came not from control, but from letting go the power to trust, to wait, and to embrace the process of life, whatever it may bring. The emperor had come to realize that the foundation of true leadership was not built on wealth, power, or even wisdom alone. The most transformative practice he had adopted was the ability to lead with compassion, with selflessness, and with an open heart. Yet there remained another lesson that had begun to show its true importance, a lesson he had only begun to grasp. The power of kindness without expectation. Throughout his reign, the emperor had been surrounded by advisors, generals, and citizens who often sought recognition for their good deeds. In his court, he had grown accustomed to acts of kindness being performed with the hope of receiving praise or rewards in return. Whether it was a generous gift, a diplomatic gesture, or a public service, there was always an expectation, a silent agreement that kindness would eventually bring some form of compensation or recognition. But as the emperor deepened his practice of Zen, he saw the hollowness of such conditional kindness. The true value of kindness, he realized, was not in the rewards it could bring, but in the act itself, selfless, pure, and free from any need for external validation. He remembered the teachings of the monk who had often spoken of generosity without attachment, the idea that true kindness is offered freely, without any expectation of return. One morning, a messenger arrived at the palace with urgent news. A poor widow had traveled from a distant village seeking help. She had lost her home to a flood, and her children were sick. The emperor was moved by her story, but he knew that such pleas for help were not uncommon. In the past, he would have sent aid, but with the condition of receiving something in return, perhaps a pledge of loyalty, perhaps a gift of land or resources. But as the emperor sat in his chamber, the words of the monk echoed in his mind. True kindness is given freely, without expectation. He had been conditioned, like so many, to think that acts of kindness were transactions. But now, he saw that this was not the path to wisdom or peace. The emperor decided, then and there, to offer his assistance without condition. He instructed his advisors to provide the widow with all the help she needed: food, shelter, medicine for her children, and a safe place to stay. He did not ask for anything in return. The act of kindness in this moment was its own reward. As the days passed, the emperor noticed something profound. Though his actions had gone unnoticed by the public, no grand ceremony, no applause, the sense of peace he felt within himself grew. There was no external validation, no recognition for his kindness, but something deeper stirred within him. He understood now that kindness, when offered freely, was not only a gift to the recipient, but also to the giver. The act itself, the simplicity of helping another without the expectation of receiving anything in return, had brought him a sense of joy and fulfillment that no material reward ever could. The emperor began to practice this form of kindness in his daily life. He no longer expected his acts of generosity to be acknowledged. He did not seek the approval of others, nor did he look for accolades. Instead, he found joy in the act itself, in the silent understanding that kindness was its own reward. He began to help those in his kingdom, not because he expected them to praise him, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. This shift in perspective had a profound effect on the emperor's court. His advisors, too, began to act with greater compassion, motivated not by the desire for reward, but by the simple act of giving. They learned that kindness, when offered without expectation, became a source of genuine connection and peace. One day, as the emperor walked through the palace gardens, he encountered a soldier who had been injured in battle. The soldier was an old man, worn by the years of service to the empire. The emperor had seen this man many times, but today, the soldier seemed different. His shoulders slumped, his eyes dull with exhaustion. The emperor stopped to speak with him. "How are you, old friend?" the emperor asked, his voice soft and compassionate. The soldier looked up at the emperor, a faint smile crossing his face. "Your Majesty," he said, "I am well, but I feel weary. I have fought for this empire for so long, and now I wonder if my service is truly valued. I have seen many young soldiers take my place, and yet I remain here, waiting." The emperor studied the soldier for a moment, then placed his hand gently on the man's shoulder. "Your service is not measured by the number of battles fought or the rewards given. True service is in the act itself, in the kindness you have shown to your brothers and sisters in arms, in the way you have lived your life with integrity. You have given all that you can, and for that you are valued not by the empire, but by me." The soldier's eyes filled with tears, and he bowed his head in respect. "Your Majesty, I have only ever served because it was the right thing to do. I never expected anything in return." The emperor smiled. "And that is what makes you great, my friend. You have given selflessly without expecting a reward. This is the truest form of kindness, one that is offered freely, without any thought of recognition or compensation. And for that, you have earned the greatest reward of all, the peace that comes from knowing that your actions have been true." As the emperor continued to embody this principle of kindness without expectation, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere of his court. People no longer sought rewards for their deeds, nor did they wait for recognition before acting. The emperor had created an environment where kindness flourished, not for the sake of receiving praise, but simply for the joy of giving. This environment, rooted in selfless compassion, became the foundation of his reign. He began to see that true leadership was not about forcing others to follow, but about inspiring them to live with integrity and compassion. When he acted with kindness, when he gave freely without expecting anything in return, he set an example for his people to do the same. The ripple effect of his actions spread throughout the kingdom, transforming the way people related to each other. There was a quiet, pervasive joy that filled the empire, not because of grand gestures or extravagant rewards, but because people had learned that true happiness came from selfless acts of kindness. The emperor had learned that kindness, when given freely, had the power to heal wounds and build bridges. It was not about what one received in return, but about the joy that arose from giving without expectation. And in this simple act of selfless generosity, the emperor found a peace that no wealth or power could ever provide. And so, the emperor continued on his path, not seeking validation or applause, but living each day with compassion, kindness, and the quiet wisdom that came from knowing that the greatest treasures in life are those that are given freely, without the need for recognition. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the emperor's understanding of compassion and kindness deepened. His reign had become one of peace, not because of his conquest or the wealth of his kingdom, but because he had learned to lead with love, to lead with the quiet strength that came from his growing wisdom. But there was still one more lesson to learn, one that would challenge him to embody kindness in the most unexpected of ways, through selfless acts of generosity, even when no one was watching. The emperor was reminded of a simple story, one that he had heard long ago from the monk who had taught him so much. It was a story about a hermit, a man who had lived in isolation, far from the hustle and bustle of the world. This hermit, unlike the many wealthy and powerful figures in the emperor's court, had nothing but his humble hut, a small patch of land, and the love he shared with nature. One day, an old woman from a nearby village came to visit the hermit. She had heard of his wisdom and had traveled to seek his counsel, for she was facing many struggles in her life. Her husband was ill, her crops had failed, and she was deeply troubled by the hardships of her circumstances. When she arrived at the hermit's hut, she poured out her heart, telling him her troubles and asking for guidance. The hermit, without saying a word, listened intently to her pain. He did not offer advice, nor did he try to fix her problems. Instead, he stood up, walked to a nearby well, and drew a bucket of water. He handed it to the woman, who drank gratefully. The hermit said nothing, merely offering his kindness in silence. The next day, the woman returned with the same complaint, the same troubles. Once again, the hermit listened patiently and then fetched another bucket of water. He gave it to her without question, without judgment. The woman, now somewhat puzzled, drank the water and left. This simple act of kindness, repeated day after day, continued for many weeks. The woman, who had initially come seeking grand wisdom or profound advice, began to understand that the hermit's wisdom lay not in words, but in his actions. He had not tried to solve her problems or offer her quick fixes. Instead, he had given her something far more valuable, a simple, unspoken act of compassion without expectation of return. The emperor found himself reflecting on this story, realizing that kindness did not always need to be grand or visible. The hermit's act of drawing water from the well was not a flashy display of generosity. It was quiet, humble, and deeply meaningful. The emperor understood that true kindness did not require recognition or applause. It did not need to be acknowledged by others in order to have value. Kindness, when offered with sincerity, was its own reward. One afternoon, as the emperor was walking through the palace gardens, he encountered a young gardener who was tending to the flowers. The gardener was bent over, carefully planting seeds in the soil. His face focused and calm. The emperor observed him for a moment, struck by the simplicity of the act. The gardener was not seeking praise, nor was he looking for any recognition. He was simply doing his work with care and dedication. The emperor, moved by the gardener's quiet commitment, approached him and asked, "Why do you tend to these flowers so carefully, with such dedication, even when no one is watching?" The gardener looked up, his face serene. "I tend to them not for recognition, Your Majesty, but because it is what I do. It is my way of offering something beautiful to the world. Even if no one notices, the flowers do not need to be admired for them to be valuable. They are valuable because they exist, because they bring beauty into the world without asking for anything in return. The emperor nodded, his heart touched by the gardener's words. He realized that this was the essence of selfless kindness, the act of giving without expectation, without needing anything in return. It was the quiet, humble acts that mattered most, the ones that did not seek recognition or reward. The emperor understood that this was the true power of generosity. From that day forward, the emperor made it his practice to offer acts of kindness in silence, without the need for recognition. He would help the people of his kingdom not because it would bring him praise, but because it was the right thing to do. He would give without expectation, understanding that true generosity came from the heart, not from a desire for external validation. One winter, when a severe storm struck the kingdom, the emperor heard of a family in a remote village that had lost their home to the harsh winds. Without hesitation, he instructed his advisors to send a caravan of supplies to the village. But he did so quietly, without fanfare. He did not announce his actions to the people or seek any acknowledgement. He simply acted, knowing that the joy of helping was the only reward needed. Months later, the villagers, unaware of the emperor's silent generosity, heard rumors of his actions. They were deeply moved, not because they had been given something, but because the emperor had acted with no expectation, no desire for recognition. His kindness had come from a place of pure compassion, and it had touched their hearts in a way that words could not. The emperor had learned that the true reward of kindness lay not in what was received, but in the act itself. The Buddha's teachings had illuminated this truth for him. Generosity, when offered selflessly, was a reflection of the compassion within. It did not need applause or recognition. It was a quiet offering to the world, a simple gesture that rippled out into the lives of others, creating a legacy of goodness and peace. As the emperor continued his reign, he found that his actions spoke louder than his words. He no longer sought validation or recognition for his deeds. His leadership, his kindness, and his wisdom were seen not in his declarations, but in the way he lived his life. By offering kindness without expectation, he had created a kingdom grounded in compassion, where the people felt not just the warmth of his rule, but the genuine care that flowed from him. The emperor's understanding of kindness had transformed his heart, and his reign had become not one of power or control, but one of quiet, selfless leadership. And in that silence, in those simple acts of generosity, the emperor found the peace that no wealth, no title, and no recognition could ever provide. As the emperor's reign continued, he became more and more attuned to the delicate balance of peace and power. He had learned to detach from the noise of the world, to cultivate inner stillness, to act with patience, and to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. But the most profound lesson he had learned was the power of silence, of listening, reflecting, and allowing time to reveal what words could not. For years, the emperor had relied on speeches, decrees, and grand proclamations to make his voice heard. He believed that to lead was to speak often, to assert authority, and to show the people that he was a man of action. But now, as his practice deepened, he began to see the wisdom of the monk's silence. Silence was not absence. It was not emptiness. Silence was a space where true understanding could arise, a space where one could listen, not just to others, but to the whispers of the heart. One evening, as the emperor sat alone in his private chamber, he reflected on the years that had passed since he first encountered the monk. He thought about all that he had learned, all that had changed within him. He had come to realize that the greatest power was not in what one could say, but in what one could be. He understood now that silence was not about avoidance or detachment, but about creating a space where wisdom could arise naturally. In the past, he had been quick to speak, quick to act, quick to decide. But now, as he looked back, he saw how often his hasty decisions had been driven by the need for control, the need to be seen as decisive, the need to prove himself. He had spoken and acted without truly listening, without allowing the space for reflection. His words had been reactions, not responses. His actions had been driven by his desires and his fears, not by true clarity or wisdom, but silence, he realized, allowed him to pause, to reflect, and to listen to both the world around him and the quiet wisdom within. It was in these moments of silence that he found the clarity to lead not through force or authority, but through presence and understanding. One day, a great dilemma arose in the emperor's court. A neighboring kingdom had threatened to invade, and the emperor's advisors urged him to act quickly to prepare for war. The pressure was immense. The kingdom's safety was at risk, and the people looked to the emperor for a swift and decisive response. The emperor, however, did not rush into action. He called for a council meeting, but instead of speaking immediately, he asked for silence. He requested that everyone present take a few moments to reflect deeply on the situation, to listen to their hearts, and to the wisdom of their own minds. The room was filled with uneasy silence as everyone waited for the emperor to speak. But he remained still, his gaze focused inward. After several long moments, the emperor stood and spoke softly, but with great authority. "We have been quick to act in the past," he said, "but today I ask you to pause, to reflect. The decision we face is not one that can be made in haste. We must listen to the situation, listen to the heart of the people, and listen to the wisdom that lies beyond fear and desire." He went on, "I will not act until I am certain that my response comes from clarity, not fear. We will wait until the right course of action presents itself, not in the noise of urgency, but in the stillness of wisdom." The advisors were shocked at first. They had expected the emperor to immediately call for military action, to prove his strength and decisiveness, but instead, he had chosen silence, reflection, and patience. The emperor's calm, unwavering decision in that moment spoke volumes. His leadership was not about reacting to pressure or responding to external forces. It was about creating space for clarity, for wisdom to arise naturally. Days passed, and the emperor remained still. Both outwardly and inwardly, he did not act in haste. Instead, he spent his time in deep reflection, meditating on the situation, seeking guidance from the quiet wisdom within. He listened to the needs of his people, heard the concerns of his advisors, and considered the long-term consequences of any decision he made. It was during this time that the emperor came to understand something vital. True leadership did not come from external action alone. It came from the ability to listen to the world, to the people, and to oneself. In the end, the emperor made a decision that stunned his advisors. Instead of war, he proposed a peace treaty with a neighboring kingdom. His reasoning was simple. The strength of a ruler lies not in his ability to conquer, but in his ability to listen, to seek peace, and to avoid unnecessary conflict. The treaty was a difficult one to negotiate, but with time and patience, it was signed, bringing peace to both kingdoms. The emperor's leadership, now rooted in silence and reflection, had transformed his kingdom. His reign was no longer characterized by the fear of failure or the need to control every outcome. Instead, it was marked by calm wisdom and clarity, by the willingness to listen, and by the deep understanding that true leadership was about guiding the people with compassion and patience. And as the emperor reflected on the path he had walked, he realized that the greatest gift he could offer to his kingdom was not in the words he spoke, nor in the power he held, but in his ability to be present, to listen with an open heart, to act with clarity, and to lead with wisdom. His peace, now unshaken by external forces, had become the foundation upon which his kingdom thrived. The emperor's wisdom had grown, not through his achievements, but through his ability to remain silent, to listen, and to reflect. In silence, he had found the deepest truth, the truth that peace comes not from external circumstances, but from the quiet wisdom that resides within. As he walked through the palace garden, the emperor felt a deep sense of gratitude. His journey, though not yet complete, had brought him to a place of deep peace, a peace that no one could take away, a peace that came from within. The emperor knew that true power did not lie in the desire to control or in the need to be seen as strong. True power lay in the ability to remain still, to listen, and to act from a place of deep, unshakable peace. His journey was ongoing, but now he walked it with clarity, compassion, and the quiet wisdom that had been his greatest teacher